All right. All right. So we'll get going here. It's 9:15. So we're going to hit the 15th Amendment tonight. This is going to be the last one of Reconstruction. So if you remember, Reconstruction was right after the Civil War. We came out with 3 amendments called during Reconstruction. Does anybody have any questions on 13 or 14 before we get into this? A lot covered under 14. Does anybody have any questions on 13? Everybody understands Reconstruction for the most part, knows where to find it. All right. All right, so then I guess we'll get into 15 if nobody has questions. Where's my thing? There we go. All right, so the 15th Amendment. This one's pretty short. Seems like it should be pretty easy, but there's quite a history behind it. And not a good history. This is one of those where we're going to talk about how shitty the United States was. Not is, but was. So what the 15th Amendment says. Section 1 is the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So what does it mean? Uh-oh, history's not supposed to be there yet. So the easy answer, and it's pretty easy to read it, see it in black and white. The amendment prohibited all race-based qualifications for voting, although it was absolutely 100% designed for African Americans. It was to create equality with the African Americans, to allow them to come in and vote. God, I got a whole lot running through my head, and I don't remember exactly what I put in here. I don't want to step on my own toes. So that's the way it was supposed to work, right? The rugged Constitution. Man, I don't have my rugged Constitution here. Somebody have the rugged Constitution? Somebody have it available?
Bill has it. He's pulling it out.
All right. You got it, Bill?
I got it right here.
All right. So can you do me a favor and read, the section that explains what the amendment means? If you could do me a favor and just read that, whoever wants to read it. Mine's upstairs.
Okay. This amendment ordered both the federal and the state governments not to keep any citizens from voting because of race or color or because they had once been slaves. Yet it did not give all citizens the right to vote. The states could obey the amendment and still be free to decide which of their citizens should have this right. Many states did not give women the right to vote until 1920, when Amendment 19 was added to the Constitution. Yet Amendment 15 helped to strengthen the people's control over their government.
Okay. So here is the...
I'm going to read the deny. And, yep.
What's that?
Underneath that says, you deny to all governments within the United States the right to keep anyone from voting because of his color or race or because of his having been a slave. You get assurance that fewer restrictions will be placed on the right of citizens to vote.
Okay. So here is the problem with the rugged Constitution. And I love it. You guys know I love the rugged Constitution. What's the copyright on that? 1950 something?
58. We got a 50, a 52, a 69, and a 14.
All right. So 1950, that's when it was first written. So here is the problem with the rugged Constitution. The rugged Constitution was sugarcoating history. All right. They mentioned in there that women didn't have the right to vote, but they did not mention anywhere in there in 1950 that African Americans still did not have the right to vote. And it was absolutely happening. So the not so easy answer is that it did nothing to secure the African American vote. Nothing, right? They were just empty words. They were empty words until about 1965 with all the civil rights acts that came out. The first 20, 30 years went well for the 15th Amendment. and there was actually more than 2,000 African Americans being elected to various offices. So 1870, this thing is ratified. Goes good for about 30 years, 20 years, and all of a sudden, especially the southern states, started realizing what's happening. And they did not like the fact that African Americans were voting in huge numbers, and that they were starting to get a controlling interest in governments, that they were actually being elected to offices. So in 1890, it all changed, right? So if we had continued on this path that we did for the first 20 years or so, it would have been great. But that's just not the way it went. So Jim Crow law started, poll taxes, literacy tests. So what happened was the southern states decided, look, fine, you know what, we're going to comply. Everybody has a right to vote. But in order to vote, you got to pass a literacy test. You got to pay poll taxes. All of these things that they were doing, they were looking at your character. And all of these things that they were doing negatively affected African Americans disproportionately, obviously, right? We're talking about slaves that were coming out, that were slaves just 30 years ago. And you're giving them a literacy test. So the Supreme Court, I just don't remember where I was at here with this. All right. So the Supreme Court was pretty wishy-washy early on. They did, however, in one ruling, they came out, they refused to stop the states from doing all these different, putting up all these roadblocks. They said it was a states' rights issue. But what they did do is there was a grandfather clause, basically, for all of the white voters who failed the literacy test, and they were still allowed to vote. If you were black, you failed the literacy test, you were not allowed to vote. Supreme Court saw that. They said, look, this is absolutely 100% discriminatory. We are not going to allow this to fly. So they stopped that. But they did not stop. Obviously, we know the history of Jim Crow laws. They did not stop poll taxes. They did not stop any of this other stuff that was being thrown up until 1965. So in 1869, Republicans felt the need for an amendment to protect the African-American vote and stave off any claims of the North being hypocritical. Now, Republicans in 1869, they were worried that they said, look, we fought the Civil War, we won the Civil War, and we made it a condition that any Southern state that wants to come in here has to agree to these amendments. So they basically legislated that slaves were free, that slaves could vote, that African Americans could vote. And their concern was that people were going to, at that point, say, look, you know, what's good for the goose, good for the gander. Why doesn't the North have to follow these things? So that was one of the driving forces for the Republicans at that point, and decided they needed this, decided they needed an amendment. The House proposed an amendment that is basically today's 15th Amendment, but there were a whole lot of Republicans that were worried it was too broad, right? They wanted to add not only the basis of race, but they wanted to the basis of nativity, of property, of education, and creed. And by doing that, they would have effectively done away with things like literacy tests. You know, Jim Crow laws, where if you didn't own property, that you couldn't do certain things. If you know, obviously Jim Crow dealt with a whole lot more than just things as it related to voting. You know, that's where we had colored drinking fountains and segregated buses, which the Supreme Court upheld, by the way, saying that was okay as long as the service issued to both was the same, that it was okay to put blacks on one bus and whites on the other. So the Senate wanted, and a lot of the Republicans wanted, all those things added to it. But politics being politics, it never got done. And the 15th Amendment was ratified as it is today. Until 1965, blacks were not voting in large numbers. They were being intimidated at the polls. It's actually pretty disgusting when you read the history on it. And it's more than we can get into now. The case law is pretty disgusting. How the Supreme Court backed basically discrimination against the blacks, allowing all this to happen until 1965. 1965, everything kind of turned around, and now, I mean, they can claim all they want that, you know, Jim Crow 2.0, but these are all people that didn't live through Jim Crow, right? These are all people that are complaining that telling African Americans they got to get ID is discriminatory, even though you need ID to fly, you need ID to drive, you need ID for everything, you need ID to buy alcohol, you need ID for everything, and they can manage to get ID for that, but they can't manage to get ID for voting according to the left. So that is where we are right now in a nutshell. I think I go right into discussion here. I do, and that's it, basically in a nutshell. So let's talk about it. What do you guys think?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So they were giving pretty much people of color the right to vote. Why were women not included in that?
Yeah. Not until,
Why did they wait till four
not
amendments
till-
later?
Why they have to wait till what?
4 amendments later.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if they're, I mean, because I mean, at that time, I mean, the blacks, they were considered 3/5 of a citizen. So, but you would think that, you know,
Well, not at
that
that
women
time.
would have a higher.
Not at that time. Remember, we did away with that. Right?
Okay.
We
Right.
did away with that. Blacks counted for full representation at that point. You know what? I don't know the answer to that. It was still black men. They still held men in higher regard than women. I mean, that's just the way it was back then.
Yep.
Men were the breadwinners. Men were the property owners. Men did everything. Men made the decisions.
I'm wondering if the men being property owners was the main thing behind that. I mean, back then,
Well, it was at
women
first,
property
if you
owners
remember.
were really not that many.
Right.
They actually had a stake in the country.
Right.
Correct. Yeah, I guess that's it, right? They actually had a stake, and some people want to get back to that. I mean, there's talk, and where if you're not paying income tax, that you don't get to vote. If you're not, I mean, I don't ever see that happening, because if you're a citizen, you're a citizen. But
Right.
that was the thinking back then. You had a stake in the country. You were a property owner. You got to decide how this country was going to go. And my problems with it. I mean, I do have problems with it when we first started, that all men are created equal. But they weren't. They weren't at all. And they weren't here until 1965. We passed this thing in 1870. It took almost 100 years before these weren't just words on paper. I mean, the idea was great, but it just didn't come to pass like they had hoped it would come to pass.
I'm actually
There's a lot of
curious.
pushback and a lot of opposition.
Yeah, for sure. And southern states still held a lot of power. And really, if you read the history on it, there were a whole lot of Northerners that were all about freeing the slaves, not so okay with them voting. We're going to free them, but let's not get crazy, right? We don't need a whole bunch of uppity slaves running around in here making decisions for us. So, don't let the North fool you, where the North is playing the moral high ground. Certainly they had some moral high ground over the South, but they were just as much to blame here. They could have stopped this.
As for
Actually curious, and I mean this in a completely non-political way, is we had that amendment back then. The idea of them granting illegal immigrants the constitutional right to vote. I mean, that seems like that's what they're pushing for.
For what? Non-citizens?
Giving illegal
Sure.
immigrants the constitutional right to vote, which they shouldn't.
Which they
I
can't.
believe.
They can't.
Right,
And
but
it
they're
says
trying to make it they can.
The other thing that, we'll get off on a wild tangent here, but
I'm trying not to.
The Constitution is clear that the federal government has authority over naturalization, but nowhere in there does it give them authority over immigration. Immigration is reserved to the states. The states get to decide who comes into their states and who doesn't. But it's another one of those things that, well, the federal government says that they're in charge of immigration, so we let them do it. because we
Well,
don't know any better.
that brings up an interesting point. If it's regulated by each state, so when they brought the Afghan immigrants in, there were so many that came to Ohio. Was
Right.
that Ohio said we will take them?
I would
or did the
assume,
federal
and I
government
think-
just say
I-
we are
I think that,
planting them there?
I think DeWine did give the okay for that. Where was it? What state was that where they actually sent the buses back to DC or, God, man, this was last year. And I want to say it was the Syrian refugees that were coming in. There was a state that turned the refugees away. What let them get off the buses or the plane, sent the planes back.
Like Tennessee or Kentucky or something.
I don't remember. I don't remember who it was now.
You're right though. I think it was planes, and they were like, "No, nobody's getting off. You guys are turning around, going back." I did not
Right.
agree to. I think
Right.
it was Tennessee or Kentucky.
And that's one of the things today, for those of you that just got in here, I gave a talk at the Northridge Republican Club, and that was one of the things we talked about, man, is states finally standing up. And we talk about that every week here, is states finally standing up and saying, hey, look, we know our rights, and we're not going to let you trample our rights anymore. And that's what it, that's what these states are finally starting to do. But I think DeWine did give the approval for the Afghans to be resettled here.
Well, one of the issues, though, that the states have no control over is what's happened, like recently with the Haitian immigrants that came over. They're just being dispersed through the country, and the states don't even know that they're being dropped off.
Right.
So that's the end round that they're using.
Nope, 100%. Federal government is just, I mean, the federal government has been, and they are out of control. But we're allowing it to happen. I mean, you guys know how I feel and how we're going to save this, or what I think we have to do. And I could be completely wrong. I don't know. Maybe the states can't rise up, but
I think there's too many. I think there's too many people that have fallen victim to believing that the federal government is the United States of America.
Correct.
Instead
Absolutely.
of states' rights being
Well, and that's one of the things we
their-
talked about
their
tonight.
highest
right?
priority.
That's one of the things we talked about tonight, that just because the president, just because the executive says this is what we're going to do, well, he's the president, he's in charge of the United States, so I guess we have to do it. Well, no, we don't. No, and the fact that we let them keep getting away with it is why we're where we're at. Now, I'm getting off. Let's get back to the 15th here. This is all stuff we can talk about in the post. So yeah, 15th Amendment. Anybody else? I mean, what do you guys think?
You mentioned a little bit about voter ID laws, and I'm just curious, with your being a police officer, have you noticed, is there a big difference between like white people versus black people, or African American versus whatever, as to who has IDs and who doesn't?
No. Well, that's a fair question. I would guess, looking back on it now, that I would say that I have more African Americans telling me they don't have ID than I do white people. White folks always have at least a state ID.
Now,
When I say that,
are you
what's that?
speaking of voting, or are you speaking of just
IDs, period.
in your day-to-day activities?
yeah,
as an
day to
officer?
day, just IDs, period. So anecdotally, am I saying that? I mean, there may be some truth to that black folks just don't have IDs, maybe, but is it that it's harder for them to get IDs? I don't think so.
Is it that they don't have them, or they don't have them with them?
Well, that's also fair, because they say they don't have them, and we end up finding them, in the system somewhere. but probably, I would say I've definitely had more African Americans that do not have IDs than I have ever had white folks. Now, that's not saying it's a lot. It's very few, very few. But it's probably more. I would say it's my experience is probably more black folks don't have IDs than white folks.
And that's a statistic, that's a political statistic that one side likes to use over the other. Is you look at a percentage and you say, oh, the percentage of African Americans that don't have it compared to the percentage of white folks that do is so high. But then if you look at the percentage of the total African American that do compared to that don't,
Right.
it's very little.
Right.
And
And that's
so
what I'm saying. I mean,
the-
I can, man, I would probably say, I mean, in my 29-year career, I mean, certainly less than 50 that I've ever run into that don't have ID. But still,
so you're looking
more-
at like one less than 1%.
Oh, way less, but still more than white folks. But yeah, it's ridiculously low. I mean,
Can I
everybody
say that
knows-
if you're too lazy or irresponsible to get an ID, then you're too lazy or irresponsible to vote?
No, for sure. Well, and you know, in a lot of these states, actually, I don't know where Ohio is. I should probably know where Ohio is on this. A lot of these states are giving the IDs for free. You know, all you got to do is show up. You don't even need money. They'll just give you an ID so that you can vote.
And it's
So
like $28 in Ohio or something like
Also,
that.
if you early
they
vote,
have-
you don't even have to bring your ID with you. You can give them the last 4 digits of your social security number as your ID.
is that right?
They
Yeah,
can't charge you for an ID if it's to vote, because then that's the same as a poll tax. So if you go there to get an ID so you can vote,
Ah,
you have to
yeah.
be free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
And that's been the argument. That's why you said you think they're giving away for free. They are. They will give you a state ID for free so that you can vote. But driver's license, now that's going to cost you something to fly on a
Right.
plane. Going to cost you.
Right,
That new
right.
compliant
No, that's-
ID is ridiculous. That new compliant ID, you need all kinds of identification and a bill
Just
and
the
your
first
name
time.
and all kinds of crap.
Just be glad you're not a girl, and just be glad you're not a divorced woman. Holy smokes. The
If you
amount,
Amen.
I say
the
if you're
amount that
going, you have
women
to use your
need to prove who
passport.
they are.
Get
is
your
unbelievable.
passport. To get your passport, it's easy, last 10 years, you're good.
Yeah.
I was telling Chris that just last night because he has to renew his license on the 6th. I said, thank God that I changed my last name back to my maiden name before I married you. Because when I went to get my license, I didn't have to bring my divorce decree and all that other crap.
Right. It's horrible. So anyway, that's the complaint now, right? They're trying to use 15th Amendment issues, or raising a 15th Amendment issue on a lot of this stuff that the right for them to vote is being abridged based on their race, which is ridiculous. And I don't think anybody's won it yet, but I don't know how the courts go, man. It's only a matter of time before you get some sympathetic judges, and they stack the Supreme Court like they keep threatening they're going to, which I don't think they will, because they know that's going to come back to bite them pretty quick. But yeah, it could easily change voting in this country for the rest of our lives. Ridiculous, but it could.
I have a handy tip from school. If you're trying to memorize the amendments, Reconstruction is the catchphrase, free citizens can vote. So if you want to memorize them all, that's something that helped me memorize them for tests and conversations with others.
It's what?
Free citizens can vote. 13th, 14th, 15th. That's just how we were taught to memorize Reconstruction. Kind of like how with the 4th, 5th, and 6th, it's all like the natural progression of getting in trouble and your rights. The 13th, 14th, 15th is free citizens can vote.
All right.
That's
Yeah,
just how, so we don't sound like total idiots when we tell people we're constitutionalists. We can memorize it easier.
Yep, right. And and I wanted to mention that today at my talk, but I just got I get off on tangents, man, and get passionate and start yelling. that's one of the things I want to say too, is that, you know, I don't expect anybody to memorize the Constitution. I don't expect anybody to memorize every amendment. The whole point of this, though, is that you know, when you hear something, you know it's wrong, right? And you know how to go find the information now. So now maybe you go back, you know, to the 13th Amendment or to the 14th Amendment, and you're able to read it and you know where that information is. It's just like me working, right? I don't remember the entire Ohio Revised Code, but I know that if somebody's talking about an aggravated robbery, I know where the criminal section is, I know where the robbery section is, and I know how to find aggravated robbery. And that's all I'm after here. I'm not after anybody memorizing the whole Constitution or, and I know that's not your point, Daniela, but I'm not, you know, I don't want anybody to think that you need to know every single amendment. If somebody at that meeting tonight had asked me what I think about the 22nd Amendment, shit, what? No idea what it is. You know,
I agree
I
with
left
it.
my pocket constitution in the car. Jay.
yeah, I mean, I would have no idea. I don't know, but I know where to go find it, and I understand the way it's written, and I understand, you know, the words that were used then. I mean, I could read it and we could talk about it. You give me 3 minutes and we can talk about it. I know right where it is. So that's all I'm after here. I don't expect anybody to memorize this whole thing. Yeah, I don't even know. I mean, for as much reading as I do on it, now I'm actually,
Yeah, I was actually really glad, like during your talk this evening, that you didn't like say, "Oh, hey, Chris, by the way, so we're doing this Constitution thing. Tell me about the Fifth Amendment. Like, what have you learned in this class so far?" I'm like, "Oh, thank God he didn't ask any questions like that."
The
nah,
Fifth
man.
Amendment, keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. Fifth Amendment is shut the fuck up. Like those lawyers said. Sorry, Renee.
Well,
Oh my God, I should know. I should know the 22nd Amendment. 22nd Amendment's presidential term limits. I should know that.
but I mean, it's good to understand the history behind it as well. And,
Right.
you know,
Well,
where
you
they
know,
were coming
and it
from
is,
when
because
they made their
when
decision.
you go now to talk about the 15th Amendment, right? If anybody wants to talk about the 15th Amendment and they're talking about how, you know, when you get into the conversations with people, and it's important to be educated. So when
Right.
somebody's talking about the 15th Amendment and they're saying, "Oh, you know what? You blacks, you have no reason to be upset. The 15th Amendment gave you the right to vote. You have no reason to be upset." And you could say, "Well, hold on. You know what? They kind of do have a right to be upset, because his grandfather was not covered under the 15th Amendment. You know, the 15th Amendment looked good on paper, but here's the history behind the 15th Amendment. I mean, at least know what you're talking about before you start
Right.
throwing this around." And again, tonight, that's one of the things we talked about, right? And I put a post up earlier about, there was a one of those pages, it's, you know, impeach Joe Biden or whatever it is. But, you know, they put a post up saying, "Hey, should the president be removed with the 25th Amendment?" Well, no. I mean, what? You know, you're trying to talk about, like, you know, the Constitution, but you can't remove somebody. You cannot remove a sitting president under the 25th Amendment. I mean, at least have a basic knowledge of the Constitution before you're going to start throwing amendments out there, because it just makes us all look bad at that point. At least know what you're talking about. And I corrected them there on that page. And I actually had a few people that came on and, you know, they were respectful and we talked about it. And I said, "Look, this is what it says. It doesn't say you can remove anybody." So yeah, like you said, I mean, it's important to be educated. So even on our side, when we have these people that are just ignorant to what the Constitution really says, you know, we have so many people out there that are getting all their information off memes. And it's just, it's so frustrating.
But I will say that with all the talk of the 25th Amendment prior to us discussing it, this discussion actually gave a lot of clarity to it. Where, I mean, I was listening to the talking heads and hearing 25th and about being removed. And I was like, "Oh, is that what that does?" And then through discussion, you know, it educated me enough that now I feel like I can
at least get in the conversation.
get in the
At least, you
conversation.
know,
Exactly.
Right. Tell people, "Look, man, we can't remove him, but here's what we can do. Right? We could take all of his power away and give it to the vice president, but he's still going to be president." Which really, I mean, that would be best case scenario for us. Last thing we want is for him to be removed, right? If he gets removed, then Harris has a shot at 10 years, 10 years as president. Now, I don't think it's going to happen, but she would have that shot. You invoke the 25th, he's still president, she's still vice president. So we at least can carve 2 years off of how much time she could be the president.
Yeah, the problem is
But
that a
if
lot
she-
of people are just so, they're all about reading the headlines.
They are.
and
They're about reading the
society's
headlines.
gotten so like stupefied by memes and GIFs and all that stuff. That's all they see.
And
And
they're
that's all they
about their-
believe.
They're about their friend, right? Their friend who, and I was very clear tonight. I told these guys, I'm like, look, I'm just some dumb guy who has an opinion and internet access. I mean, that's me. I didn't go to school for this, but I read it and I know what it says and I'm able to understand English, right? So when we come to this group, I learn just as much here as you guys learn. But you get these people that are talking to their friends who have zero knowledge of anything, who saw a meme and now they're out there spouting all this garbage off. And then they start spouting garbage off. And then we have a whole section of people who believe you can remove the sitting president of the United States using the 25th Amendment. And then they get mad when it doesn't happen. And it's so frustrating.
That's
But the
why
20
I'll say my post to Gus.
like the amendment, it sounded like the one that was kind of circular, that it didn't really serve its purpose. Like you could look at the 15th right now and say, those words are pure. It's not flawed. It's people that didn't follow it. But the 25th, if somebody was to ask me which amendment I don't fully support, I would say it's the 25th. Sounds like you could take away their powers and then they could just take them right back. Like it didn't really work.
Well, they could petition to have them back. It doesn't, the cabinet still has the final say. Well, not the final say, but the cabinet could still say no, and then it goes to Congress. So it's not like he can just come in and say, oh, I'm fine now. And then they have to give him his power back. You know, if he came in here and said, look, I'm fine, the cabinet could still say, you're not fine. I know you think you're fine. It's cool, but you're not fine. And then he would argue that. And then remember, it has to go to Congress and then Congress gets to make the final decision.
Have you looked at that cabinet?
Well,
I mean,
half
well,
that
no, and
cabinet's
that's, I mean,
not
I guess
fine.
that's always part of the problem, right?
it's like,
Everything has turned partisan now. Everything.
Right.
Nothing works like it should. Impeachment was never supposed to be a partisan. It was supposed to be a constitutional mechanism. And now it's just partisan. Right now, Joe Biden could do nothing to get impeached. Nothing. The House is not going to impeach Joe Biden, regardless of what he did. Look at Afghanistan. I mean,
Oh.
look at, and I got fired up tonight about this. You know, you look at the eviction moratorium where he admitted that what he was doing was unconstitutional, but he was going to continue to do it until the Supreme Court told him he can't. I mean, this is a guy who came out in public and said, I am going to violate the Constitution. How is that not impeachable? How is the House not saying, look, Joe, there's nothing we can do for you. You actually came out on national television and said you're going to violate the Constitution. There's nothing we can do. We're going to impeach you. But they don't.
Well, because they're not there for us. They're there for themselves.
Well, exactly. Exactly.
Well, hell, the Constitution itself has become a partisan thing anymore. I mean, this group itself, you said it before, this group has been labeled as, I mean, it might as well be a right-wing extremist group because
Sure it
we
is.
talk about the Constitution.
Sure it is.
So, I mean, the
100%.
very document itself has become politicized and
100%.
partisan. That's
Yep.
when you know that we are FUKT.
Nice work. It's not even a real word. Nice work.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. All right.
He's
So-
a Republican, by the way.
All right. So 15th Amendment, everybody pretty much on board with the 15th. I was going to try to get the 16th in tonight, but it's just, you know what? I think there's a little bit, we're going to talk about the 16th Amendment. And 16th Amendment is income tax. It's where Congress got the power to tax your income.
Flat tax. Why is that not a thing?
Yeah, and that's what we're going to talk about next week, right?
Jesus.
and that's how the government went from something small and manageable to the behemoth it is now that we can't even possibly find the end of the string to undo it.
Correct.
I thought
Correct.
that the federal tax was imposed to cover the cost of World War I.
Well, that was the original intent, right? It was 1913 that it got ratified.
Give a
But-
little, take a lot.
You're never, when you give them an inch, you're never getting that inch back. Never.
Yep. Right.
And you know, they can tug on your heartstrings and say, we need the money for this, we need the money for that. But Fact is, once you give them the money, it ain't your money anymore, ever again,
That's right.
never again. So, and and the problem, and we'll get into 16th next week, but the problem with the income tax is right now. So what do? You repeal it? I mean, the whole nation is running based on the money that the government would collapse. It would collapse in a day if we
Debt.
took away the income tax.
We're running on debt now.
So, I mean, I guess you phase it out, maybe. I don't know. I'll have to look into it. We'll have to talk about it. Do your homework on the 16th. Do your homework on the 16th, and we'll talk about it next week, man. But
We should do
In
it
2
for
weeks.
Boston. Toss some tea in
2
the
weeks.
water.
2 weeks.
Hey, it's getting cold. When are we going back to weekly?
I think time change is probably the best. I know that
I think that gives us 2 more meetings.
at least me, it's hard for me on Tuesdays because Ella has volleyball games. And I think I should have a little more weight since I have to run these things. Come on.
I'm going back to 1776.
November 7th is when we fall back.
Okay. Good. You know what? Who's here still? Is everybody here? Renee,
Mike left.
are we done? Are we done with the 15th?
Yeah.
All right. So, Renee, we can go ahead and stop recording. I just want to do some housekeeping things real quick.
Did you want me to play video
Yeah. Yeah. At the end. At the
at
end.
the end? Okay,
Yep. I just want to talk about a couple
I'll-
things here.
I'll pause
Couple things.
recording and then I'll continue it later.
Okay. Just with a song. So Renee's going to record this because I want to see how it plays out on YouTube. So this is how I'm going to take the meetings out from now on. I love it. It's my favorite song. Y'all have heard it, but it's fantastic. So
Are you gonna be able to do that with like copyright?
that's why we're doing it. We're going to see what happens this first
Oh, I
time.
was hoping it was this song.
Oh, it is. It is. So, all right. I will see you guys in the post. Hang tight for the whole song.